Hello, my name is Susan Becker, and I'm General Counsel of the ACLU of Ohio at present. I've actually been involved with the ACLU for more than 20 years in a variety of capacities, all of them volunteer. I was born and raised in Lafayette, Indiana, and I often describe Indiana as a great place to be from, not a place I'd currently want to live. It was a very conservative area. And so I moved from there to the Cleveland area many years ago and then became involved in the ACLU. The ACLU has been fundamental in my growth, both professional and on a personal level. And I am so proud of all the work that we've done over the years on a whole variety of rights, whether it's voting rights or racial equality, women's rights, certainly LGBT rights. And I really appreciate this opportunity to tell you a little bit more about my personal involvement and why I think the ACLU is a kind of organization that everyone should be involved in if they care about this democracy and they care about the future of this country.
Today is Wednesday, August 8th, 2018, and we are here in the ACLU of Ohio Cleveland office with Susan Becker, a longtime social justice activist and supporter of the ACLU. In her roles as a litigator, professor, and ACLU board member, Susan has spent her life using the law as a weapon for change. Over the years, she's practiced and taught in various areas of the law, but her passion lies with sexual orientation discrimination law and the rights for the LGBT community. Your interviewer today is Meghan DeVol, an intern with the ACLU of Ohio. Susan, it's a pleasure to be with you today. Can we start with a few background questions?
Absolutely.
Alrighty, can you tell me about your childhood?
Sure. I've thought about this a lot, and the thing I would say about my childhood is that in many ways it was the best of times and the worst of times, because I grew up in rural Indiana, which had a lot of advantages. You know, we could go out and run and play in the fields, and a lot of the issues that parents have today we didn't think of, the dangers, and we just weren't concerned about that. So I had a lot of freedom. I loved being outside. I had great friends, those kind of things. On the other hand, my mother got ill when I was quite young, when I was 3. She had a brain tumor, and it was diagnosed as a benign brain tumor, but I will tell you there's no such thing, and she was ill for a very long time until she passed. So that was a very difficult part of the childhood.
What were your parents like?
Well, they were interesting people. For one thing, they married quite a bit later in life. My mother was 31, my dad was late 20s, and that was very unusual, you know, way back in the day. And my mother was tall, over 6 feet tall, redhead, she had quite a presence, as you might guess, great sense of humor, very intelligent woman. My father was also intelligent. He was about 6 feet tall, and he also had a natural curiosity about the world, about everything. He was a voracious reader, and I picked that up from him, and it's one of the traits that I share. So I hope I have my mother's sense of humor and general good demeanor and my father's sense of curiosity and intellect, and I think I was really blessed in both cases.
Were your parents at all socially conscious or involved in any sort of activism?
Well, you know, the thing about my parents, they both served in World War II. My dad was in the Navy and my mother was in the Women's Army Corps. And that brought with it a sense of patriotism and duty. But again, unfortunately, because of my mother's illness, that really took all their energy and the family's energy. The one thing they always did was vote, and they were very, very proud of that. It didn't matter if it was a local dog catcher, they were going to go out and vote in that election. And the other funny thing about that is they were on opposite sides politically, so they would very proudly march to the polls together and cancel out each other's votes.
So what age did you become socially aware then?
You know, that's a hard thing to answer at this point. One of the most influential things I remember, I was only 5 years old when John F. Kennedy ran for president, and I remember the incredible outcry in the country that there was concern that because he was Roman Catholic that we would become that the Pope would basically run the country. And I was really surprised at that. And I was raised Roman Catholic, so there was just a lot of prejudice being voiced that I had not experienced before. But you know, after that, I also grew up in the age of Martin Luther King and certainly heard his message very clearly. And, you know, the Vietnam War, the hippies and the whole idea that we were going to change the world for the better in the 60s, women coming of age. So in a very compressed, maybe 10-year period from the age of 5 to 15, there were an awful lot of things going on in this country that were all revolutions at just about every level.
So you do a lot of work with people in the LGBT community.
Yes.
So what made you aware of the discrimination that the LGBT community faces?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I am a lesbian, and I sincerely hope that's not the most interesting thing about me. But I think just living that particular life. Now, again, I will say that I have been, I think privileged is probably the best word. I know we hear a lot about white privilege, but across the board, I had some unfortunate situations growing up, as I've described, with my mother's health. But I've always managed to have a roof over my head and food and those kind of things. It doesn't take much insight to look around and see that the rest of the world isn't like that, even in your own backyard. What I found is an awful lot of my friends or acquaintances who were LGBT had been thrown out by their families or lost jobs or were denied even visitation with their own children. So when you see that happening again and again, and these are people that you know and you relate to, you realize that the world is a very unfair place, which again wasn't a shock to me, but it always seems so unfair to me that it's a population of people just trying to go about their daily lives to do the thing that everyone does, try and raise their children well and get their education and be employed and just be productive citizens. And at every turn, doors were being slammed in their faces.
So I read your essay, Being Out and Fitting In.
Yes.
And in it you talked about your childhood as a devout Catholic and your experience coming out as a lesbian in the 70s. So why did you choose to come out, and how do you feel that your life has changed since then?
I think one thing that's really clear for me, and I've heard a lot of other people, is that coming out is a process rather than an event. So what I'd say about in the 1970s, that's when I was absolutely sure, and I know people say this, but from a very early age, I was very sure that I was a lesbian. There wasn't really a word for it or a term because it wasn't spoken of that much. But starting in the 70s is when I really became, and so you start sharing with friends and a few select family members and that kind of thing. So again, the 70s were a time of amazing turmoil in this country. It spilled over from the 60s, continued into the 70s. And it was just, I don't know that I really had a choice, I guess is what I'm saying. I remember when I was 15, so that would have been about 1970, sneaking into a movie called The Boys in the Band. I'm not sure you've ever heard of it. It was one of the first mainstream movies it was about gay men. And I will tell you, I was so excited to see this because it was about gay people. It is one of the most depressing movies I've ever seen. It's about a man's birthday party, a group of gay friends in New York City. And they're just really mean and horrible to each other. So while they're living in this world where they're being rejected by friends and family, et cetera, they're equally horrid to each other. And I remember coming out of that feeling so depressed and feeling just so alienated from everything. I thought, if this is what the gay community looks like, that's pretty horrible. But there certainly wasn't acceptance among heterosexuals either, so it was a little bit of a bleak time. But for me, it wasn't an issue. I mean, people talk a lot about, is sexual orientation caused by nature or nurture? Is it a choice? And I can't speak to everyone's experiences, but I know for me that wasn't a question of choice. It was just a question of who I am at a cellular level. So these early experiences you might think would just push me back into the closet and do whatever I could to go a different direction. But it was very clear to me, even with the negativity that I'd experienced and other people had, and seeing movies like Boys in the Band, it was very clear to me that this is who I am and I can't be apologetic for it.
And how did your family and friends react?
Wow, it was a very mixed bag. Some of them were convinced that I was going to hell, because certainly the Catholic Church was not and is not receptive to people who are homosexuals. I lost some friends that I thought were very close. I got a common reaction that it's a phase that you're going through. Everybody goes through this as a teenager. You're just searching, so there was a lot of disbelief as well. But there was support too. Mostly among other gay friends. It's so hard to describe that time when we look at how open a lot of people are now. Saying that, I still know a number of people who are closeted, at least in certain environments, either to their family or their employer or something, and they need to be today. So I'm not saying everything's solved, but it's hard to think about what it was like 40 plus years ago, and how tight the communities were when you knew just a few other gay people, the friendships that were forged. And we supported each other, and that's where most of the support came from, were other gay and lesbian people rather than heterosexual friends and relatives.
What would you say are some common misconceptions people have about the term lesbian that you've tried to debunk over the years?
You know, the thing that I've heard a lot, and you hear it less recently, but they talk about the lifestyle. There's a lesbian lifestyle or a gay lifestyle. If there is, I never got the manual on it. I just got to tell you, I don't understand what that means. But when I've thought about it both as an academic and just as a person who's lived this life, what I see is that people take one aspect of your personality, that you're a woman and you have a sexual relationship with another woman. And first of all, they condemn that relationship as being perverted and unnatural. And they take that one aspect of your personality or behavior, they assume you're engaged in, and then that's all you are. And every person is multifaceted in terms of their interests and their talents and their strengths and their weaknesses. So I think the thing that I've tried to debunk, the thing that I've tried to emphasize, I suppose, is that all people are just human beings, and you have to take each person as they are. And whether they're a lesbian or a gay man or a straight white male who get criticized a lot today, you are just who you are, and you have to take people as individuals and not condemn them as a group.
Thank you. I kind of want to switch gears now.
Sure.
Talk about your education, your career.
Sure.
So you went to Eastern Kentucky University.
I did.
For your bachelor's degree.
Right.
And what made you choose Eastern Kentucky?
Well, I actually started out my first 2 years of college. I went to a small college in Indiana called St. Joseph's College. It was a religious college, Catholic, and the reason I chose that, it was about an hour from home, and my mother was still alive at that time, and I was her primary caregiver at that time. So, but I really wanted to be a journalist for just about forever, and once my mother was then institutionalized because of her condition, it was clear she wasn't coming back out of that situation. I was looking for other schools, colleges that I could get a good journalism degree, but I had no money, I had no assets, so I was looking for the least expensive college with the best opportunity. And I know a lot of people haven't heard about Eastern Kentucky, and when I even mention Eastern Kentucky, people get a look of horror on their face, basically. It's an amazing school. I chose it mostly because the people who taught there had been, or still were, working in the field. They'd been broadcast journalists. They'd worked at the Washington Post or the New York Times, so I knew I could get a really practical education and at a very reasonable price, and it was still relatively close to my home.
And what was attractive to you about journalism?
Oh, well, one of the things about my mother being ill is that I spent a lot of time with my grandmother. My grandmother, Mary Bell, was another force to be reckoned with. It was my dad's mom. And she had me reading at the age of 3. And I spent a lot of time with her. She didn't have a TV, and so we either listened to the radio or we read. And I always loved reading. And she loved newspapers, and she loved just every kind of genre you could think of. So I think there's a real correlation there between a love of reading and a love of writing. And I mentioned before my dad's natural curiosity, I think I inherited. So everything just came together with journalism, right? You can investigate all kinds of aspects of what's going on in the world. You can write about it using the skills that you've learned by studying other authors. When I talk about studying other authors, I'm not even talking about academically, but just having a very broad background in reading. I think it's so important. You get see the world through other people's eyes. So then as a journalist, your job is to back up and try and be as neutral as possible, take yourself out of it as much as possible, and just report on the world around you. And that worked really well for me. I really enjoyed it.
And do you believe being a journalist made you more socially conscious?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I think just on multiple levels, again, if you're a journalist, you're just, I think by definition, a voracious reader. You just consume just about everything you can, and going back to that natural curiosity, but also it's your job to find out about the world. So, and it's hard to be a voracious reader and only read about happy stories like, puppies being rescued. You have to read about the difficult things in life, and not just things in your own backyard, but things that go around local, state, national, international, all of those things. So it really sensitizes you to how fortunate you are in your own situation and how unfortunate a lot of other people are through no fault of their own.
So how did you end up in Cleveland and at Cleveland Marshall College of Law?
Well, Cleveland, as I mentioned before, after my mother had gone into an institution, my father wasn't in the picture anymore, I didn't have a home to go back to when I graduated from Eastern Kentucky in 1977. But I had spent a couple of summers up here in Cleveland with the family of a friend of mine from college. So I was familiar with Cleveland. I was looking for some job opportunities. I wasn't interested in going back to my hometown of Lafayette for a variety of reasons. It's funny looking back, Cleveland seemed like a huge, huge city to me, which of course it isn't, but it seemed like at the time. So I came up here for job opportunities and because I had friends and my best friend's family was here, so that gave me some grounding and a place to start.
And what was your law school experience like?
I love law school. I know, well, let me just say one other thing I want to talk about law school. I didn't know anything about really the hierarchy of law schools. I knew there was Harvard and Yale and that level, and then I just thought there was everyone else. So I only applied to one law school. I applied to Cleveland Marshall because I was here, and they offered me a scholarship. And I was kind of on the fence because I was working full time, and I thought, do I really want to, my career was starting to take off as a journalist a little bit, and I thought, do I really want to spend the next 3 years and a lot of money, doing this or not? But they offered me a very generous scholarship, and I was talking to a friend, and she basically said, well, where are you going to be in 3 or 4 years if you don't do this? You're very young. I thought I was all grown up at the time, but looking back, I was very young. So it was an amazing opportunity that Cleveland Marshall presented to me, and I did accept their offer, and I loved it from day one. Now, having said that, law school certainly had its downside, and I had some of the teachers that were like the professor in Kingsfield and Paper Chase. They were very demanding and probably not the best way to teach, looking back at it now as a professor. So it was hard and it was a lot of work, but I am very glad I went to law school, and I did love it from day one.
What kind of law did you start out practicing after law school?
Well, the first thing I did is I worked for a federal judge, and that was a great opportunity. I worked for a judge on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. His name was Robert Kerpansky. Actually, that name is somewhat of a legend in this area because he also had a sister named Blanche who was an appellate judge, but in the state court system. And the two of them were known for their incredibly conservative views on just about everything. So that's the first thing I did, and one of the reasons I really wanted a clerkship, and I was very fortunate to get one, is to expand my horizons and look at law from the inside out, what really happens when you're in a court, and that clerkship provided an amazing opportunity to do that. But really, having said that, I didn't really, even in law school, know what area of law I wanted to practice. I really thought, at a minimum, law school would give me a technical background for my writing. So going into law school, I thought, I can work for a legal publishing company and have, certainly pay better than newspapers did, and have a fairly sane life and a steady life and do interesting work. So that's why I went in the first place. So I wasn't really very well focused. Although while I was in law school, I was a member of the student group of the National Lawyers Guild, which is a very progressive group. So I did have some sensitivity at that time to the great work they were doing on a lot of cases that look like what the ACLU does as well.
So what made you want to switch from doing journalism and having a law background in journalism to becoming a lawyer and a litigator?
Like I said, it was really a leap of faith, I think. I look back on my life. If I showed you my resume today, Megan, it would appear that I had a very clear plan at each step. But there were so many twists and turns, and sometimes, like coming to Cleveland, that was because I had fortuitously some friends here, and I didn't really have a home to go back to. And I came to Cleveland, thought, I'll be here a couple years and then I'll move on. Well, I love Cleveland and I've had opportunities to leave, but I've stayed. But it's the same with going to law school. It really was a twist of fate. And one friend who when I was talking to said to me, she said, you really need to do this because otherwise in 3 or 4 years you'll regret that you haven't. So many things in life, including going to law school, and the reason I went, it was just fortuitous and timing and the right people saying the right things. And being in the right place to take advantage of it. So I didn't have a grand plan. The only lawyers I was really familiar with, we didn't have lawyers in our family. My family were mostly, they worked in factories and waitresses and that level. So we didn't, there wasn't really anybody. I did have an uncle who was an engineer, but it wasn't really that professional level. So even going to undergraduate school was a pretty big step for someone in my family. So law school went pretty far beyond that. So as a journalist, I'd worked for a small paper called the Solon Times, and we covered about 12 or 13 suburbs, the Sugar Valley Times and the Solon Times, in southeast Cleveland area. And the only lawyers I knew worked for municipal governments, they're law directors. It is the most boring law I think can ever be practiced. They write ordinances, and it just seemed, and I covered it for a long time, so I really didn't want to do that. But other than knowing I really didn't want to be a municipal lawyer, I didn't have a clear plan. I thought maybe it'd help with a journalist. If not, it'll open up areas that I've never considered before.
How do you feel that being a part of the LGBT community directed the kind of work that you wanted to do as a lawyer?
I think it really helped me be empathetic with clients. When you've lived some of the same experience as your clients, I think that's really, really helpful. I have to say, it's not probably my first concern. It's hard to have a hierarchy of what you care about the most. That doesn't even make sense. I think for me, a large extent, certainly racial justice is incredibly important. I've done a lot of research on the civil rights movement. I lived through parts of it. Certainly didn't have a very meaningful role in it. I'm not trying to say that, but I think racial justice is probably the most important issue that we've wrestled with for a long time. And the stain of slavery, we have to overcome that, and that's going to take a really, really long time. After that, another area that I'm incredibly passionate about is animal rights and that kind of thing. But the problem with that is it's such a high level of emotional involvement. I don't think I could do that kind of work. In fact, I know I couldn't investigate animal cruelty and prosecute those kind of cases. So LGBT, I don't want to say it was a default necessarily, but what happened is, especially when I was teaching, there were no other attorneys doing this work. There were a few, and Joyce Saverin here in Cleveland, I want to give her a shout out because she's been doing this work for a very long time. There were a few other people, but there was just no one to do the work. So it wasn't so much I was called with a passion to do this as it was people really needed help. I understood why they needed help. I had no qualms about who they were, taking them on as clients. So I developed an expertise in it pretty much in response to the need, if that makes sense.
Do you prefer practicing the law or teaching it, and why?
I like both, and they're very different. And I see it as a continuum, really. The great thing about practicing law is working with younger people, and they're at such a great age in law school, whether they've come right from undergrad or working at Cleveland Marshall, we had people who were going on to a second career, so we had the full range. But seeing them make that transition into lawyers and thinking like a lawyer, and seeing them then move out into the communities and doing great work, whether they're working for a law firm and supporting their families or they're doing cutting edge civil rights work, whatever they're doing, that's absolutely amazing. So being part of that growth process and helping inspire and educate the next generation of lawyers is an absolute privilege. I loved it. But practicing law has the same aspects to it. You're working with clients and you're helping them educate themselves. I mean, I have to say I had an awful lot of clients who would come to me with issues that weren't really legal issues, and you have to educate them as well. But you do at times have the opportunity to really make a huge difference in someone's life. And it reminds me of that old fable about, I think it's a man who pulls a thorn out of the paw of a lion or something, and they become lifelong friends. It seems like a small gesture sometimes, but sometimes a very small gesture because you know the law and you have the power that goes with understanding systems and how things work. You can help people. You can take that thorn out of their paw and make their lives so much better. So it's so hard to say, is it better to work with people as they're coming into their own and becoming empowered as lawyers to go do great things? Or is it great to be a lawyer and really help people? I just see them as two sides of the same coin, and I don't prefer one or the other. Although I will say I formally retired from teaching 4 years ago. I really miss being in the classroom. I do.
As a professor, how did you feel that education is how important education is in the struggle for social change and why?
You know, education is important at every level. I'm very concerned, I guess, about the formal education we get in this country today. As I said before, I've got a natural curiosity about everything. And the generation that I grew up with, we learned things by rote and we memorized things, and we weren't allowed to explore different things on our own. I see that happening now with formal education in general. They're teaching to the tests and facts and figures. Nobody needs facts and figures anymore. I've got a calculator and a computer. I'm good, right? I'm really concerned about that. But when we talk about education, not just what we call formal education now, but we talk about the work we do at the ACLU and other groups do to just let people know what the issues are, to put things in human terms and make it relatable to other people. Like, I'm not Muslim. I don't know what it's like to be Muslim, but I feel like through a lot of the things that I've read, both from Muslim voices and non-Muslim voices, that I have a real empathy with things like the Muslim ban, and I'm so proud of the work the ACLU did on that and continues to do, despite a lot of pushback. But so education, helping us understand ourselves and each other, that's the key to everything. To me, it's the key to everything, to having any hope of having a really good future, to become the people and the country we can be. It's all through opening our minds and education on every level. One thing I taught a lot about when I taught my sexual orientation law class, and I'm fascinated with this popular culture and how that educates, both good and bad, right? So I think about LGBT issues and things like The Ellen Show and other, movies and books and things like that just Orange is the New Black, that have just so profoundly affected the way people think. And that's all part of the education continuum, and it's just absolutely critical if we're willing to open our minds. And I will be the first to say, at times I see something new or something different, I'm like, oh, hell no. And I have to talk myself through it, open your mind a little bit, and see all the possibilities. So I can't think of anything more important than education, but maybe more importantly is just being willing to be educated and opening our minds.
In terms of litigation, what are some of the most memorable and meaningful cases that you've argued, either outside of the ACLU or within the ACLU?
Right. So, I had a pro bono practice. It was modest all the time that I taught. So that meant, I handled a lot of different cases. Probably the most meaningful is a case called Hertzler v. Hertzler, and it was litigated in Torrington, Wyoming. If you've ever been to Wyoming, I always describe it as, it's a beautiful, beautiful state, and I met a lot of nice people there. Wyoming is miles and miles of miles and miles. I mean, it just goes on, very remote area. And what happened is, a woman had been married, and she and her husband had 2 children, and she then came out as lesbian, and so they got a divorce. And he had custody of the children. He knew she was a lesbian at the time. They divorced. He had custody, but she had very liberal visitation, including summers and that kind of thing. He then remarried, and his new wife was rabidly anti-gay. So they made allegations against my client that she had sexually abused her own children. Now, this is 1994. The law generally about gay and lesbian parents was still very anti-gay and lesbian parenting. And I have someone accused of sexual abuse, which is a horrific thing. And if true, the courts really do have to bend over backward to protect the children. So the case is pending in Wyoming. My client is living here, and I was going back and forth. So I will tell you, I called a lot of different organizations, including the ACLU of Wyoming and Colorado, and I couldn't get people to return my calls. That's how caustic this case was. So I did find another very brave attorney who was based in Denver, who worked for a large firm, and the firm let her do this pro bono. And we, probably 1.5 years, 2 years litigating this case under very difficult circumstances. So that was the most profound, because we had to fight just everything. The local news was doing all kinds of stories about the case. They did a poll at one time, the local news in Torrington, Wyoming, in that region, did a poll about should lesbians be able to, gay men be able to, have access to their children, was their question. It was like 92% said absolutely not. And that's the environment we were in. The judge wrote a horrible, horrible opinion in which he cited the Bible. So we took it up on appeal. And on appeal at the Wyoming Supreme Court, we convinced the court that the court the trial court erred as a matter of law, in relying on the other side's expert, who was a minister. They relied that they found the facts wrong, that they violated evidentiary standards. I mean, any one of these things independently should have reversed the case in our favor, and the Wyoming Supreme Court, by a 3-2 decision, still upheld the trial court's opinion. Now, the good thing was they remanded it, and over time we were able to work out a better solution. But for that entire time, my client couldn't see her children unless there was a court-supervised person sitting there, and it just caused all kinds of issues for the children and the family. But we continued, fighting that case. I think ultimately we got to a good resolution, but it was just bruising. But it was an important case because one thing the Wyoming court did say is that being gay was not a per se reason to keep parents from their children, and that is a huge issue. That issue was just starting to be recognized throughout the United States. So I'm very proud of that case. Like I said, it was bruising. My heart broke for my clients, and especially her kids every day. Every day, it was horrible. But I think it was really important, and I'm very proud of the work we did because, we stepped up when no one else would.
So in terms of your work with the ACLU,
yes.
When did you have your first encounter with the ACLU?
I don't know the exact date, but I do remember it. So I was a member at the time of a group called the Ohio Human Rights Bar Association, and we were a nonprofit and officially organized, but it was a pretty loose group of about 10 or maybe 20 attorneys. Because again, back at this time, this is late 80s, early 90s, coming out professionally was sort of the kiss of death. So Chris Link, who was then the director of the ACLU of Ohio, spoke at our annual luncheon or dinner, whatever it was, for the Ohio Human Rights Bar Association, and I will never forget what she said. We were meeting literally, like in secret, perhaps they had to have a secret handshake to get into the organization, that kind of thing, because everyone was so closeted in their professional roles. And Chris said to us, Chris Link, then director of the ACLU, said, "You are on the cutting edge of civil liberties work. What you're doing is important. It's critical to the future of this country and civil rights in general, and you should hold your head high and stand tall, and we will stand with you." And I still get teary-eyed thinking about that because no one had said that to us before. We were kind of the rejects. We were literally meeting in the back alleys. It was ridiculous. And she said that, and I said, I got to learn more about this organization. So I know I joined in 1990, so that was probably right around that time, but it was one of the most inspiring speeches I've ever heard.
So how do you feel that your career over time has overlapped and intertwined with the ACLU's values and the work that you do here at the ACLU of Ohio?
It has been amazing. It has been a beautiful synergy where I think my work with the ACLU, I think it's helped the organization, but it's also reflected well in my teaching and in my practice. And vice versa, my practice, I'm a much better lawyer for having been associated with the ACLU and seeing how we fight legal battles, not just that we fight them. And teaching, again, being connected to the world. I couldn't run a full docket of litigation when I was teaching. The timing just wouldn't work. I did selective cases, it was very modest. But being associated with the ACLU, so going back into the early 90s, I was on our legal committee here. And one of the things the legal committee did is review cases to decide whether we would take them or not. So I could be involved in cutting edge work and helping the ACLU frame its docket. Even though I didn't have the opportunity to actually litigate those cases. So it's just been an amazing relationship. And like I said, I hope I've contributed to the ACLU, but I know the ACLU has contributed in so many ways to my teaching, to my writing, to my skills as a lawyer. It's been just an amazing relationship. I will say one thing, and I think I want to say this. This doesn't mean that it's always been extremely happy, and we take on tough issues, and there have been times when I've been very angry at the organization. And I remember, again, Chris Link saying, if you're not angry at least half the time, you shouldn't be an ACLU member. So, and that's absolutely true, but there have been times I've had to work through issues that were very, as we all have. So it hasn't always been the most comfortable relationship, but I think that there's something important about living in discomfort and I said earlier about educating ourselves, you have to open your mind, and it's uncomfortable. And I think having gone through a lot of those, and still at the end of the day, sometimes I've agreed with the ACLU position. Most times I have, sometimes I haven't, but I've understood the position and always been willing, to back it. So I think it's been an amazing relationship, not despite of, but perhaps because of the fact that I didn't always disagree and the issues are so difficult.
What cases that you either reviewed or just remember in either the ACLU of Ohio or the ACLU National?
Yes.
What cases stand out to you in your memory?
There are three, there are so many cases, but the three First Amendment cases that really come to mind I think about so much because they come up all the time. First are the Skokie case, where this was before my time, but the organization represented a group of Nazis that wanted to, and did in fact, march in a predominantly Jewish suburb in Illinois. That was a very difficult case. We lost a lot of backers at that time. I ran into somebody at a meeting 2 years ago, it was a former colleague of mine, and he said, "So you're still working with the ACLU?" And I said, "Yes." And he's identifies very strongly as Jewish. He's a wonderful guy, identifies very strongly as Jewish. And he said, "Well, I was an ACLU member until Skokie, and I quit then because I was just so offended." And I said, "We've done a lot of good work since then." And he said, "Absolutely, I should rejoin, but I just can't." So that was a couple years ago, so that continues. So the Skokie case. The other thing is I've had the opportunity to meet the lawyers like David Goldberger who did that case, and the toll it took on them personally, death threats, and their families falling apart, and just, so that has had a profound influence on me. Two other First Amendment cases. One we took here, actually two cases here. One was the case that involves the Phelps family. That's the Westboro Baptist Church family that's based in Kansas. They're officially known, their website is godhatesfags.com. And this is the group that protests just about everywhere. And their opinion is that everything bad that happens in this country, whether it's wildfires or floods, everything that happens is the result of this country being too promiscuous and too approving of gay people. What happened in Ohio was they were protesting, the Phelps clan, they were protesting funerals of soldiers who died in Iraq and Afghanistan. And again, they have, they said their signs say, God hates fags, God loves dead soldiers. They're just awful. And they were protesting funerals. So in response, Ohio passed a law which restricted when they could protest and how close they could protest. So they wanted to sue. And no one wants to represent the God hates fags people. We certainly didn't as the ACLU of Ohio, but it did fall on us. And we did successfully challenge the state law that restricted it. We didn't have a complete victory, but they changed, they had what they called a floating buffer zone around it, and that was just too vague, so that got thrown out. And so there's some other tweaks to the law that are very important, because what we always say is it's not just this group we're concerned about, it's any group. And tomorrow it might be, people protesting in favor of voting rights or women's rights or racial equality or those kind of things. So we keep that in mind. That was a really hard case for me when we voted on it, because I know the hatred these people have towards me personally and towards gay people generally, and I think the harm they do. So that was hard. We did the right thing, and I agreed with it, but it was very hard. And then fast forward another First Amendment case to just 2 summers ago when the Republican National Convention was here. And we fought, and again, I give credit to our ferocious and incredibly talented legal director, Freda Levinson, for this, as well as Elizabeth Bonham, our staff attorney. The city and it wasn't just the city, but in working with Homeland Security and all of the other agencies that work to secure an event like this, they had enacted incredibly restrictive regulations as to who could protest, when they could protest, where they could protest, what you could carry into the event zone, those kind of things. So we really, really fought that as a First Amendment case, and our arguments were they were being too restrictive. What's hard about that is, it's not that it was Republican, we're nonpartisan. It wasn't that our lead plaintiffs were citizens for Trump or bikers for Trump. That's fine, they have a right to protest. The hardest thing for me in that case is we live in a very, very dangerous time. And when you're talking about any convention of that size, you know there are going to be terrorist threats. So I think the hardest thing for me in that particular case was we're fighting so that more people can enter this area, so that more people can engage in free speech and all of that. And always in the back of my mind was, if something goes wrong here, if there is an attack of some kind, will there be blood on our hands? I mean, that's a very real threat that we, especially now, post Charlottesville and the things that have happened with the rise of the alt-right and the protests and the violence that happens, it's a very real concern. So I just look at this is just one slice of the work we do, from how brave the ACLU was back in the day with Skokie, and then fast forwarding to the ACLU of Ohio dealing with, the Fred Phelps case and the God Hates Fags people and being really brave in that instance, and then the Republican National Convention. And I think another thing that these cases show, this trilogy of cases, is that people tend to think of the ACLU, there's so many myths. And one of them is that we're just knee-jerk. We see there's an issue and we run into court. And if you could spend one afternoon with us in a legal team meeting or at a board meeting and see how carefully we parse out the issues and try and figure it, not because we're afraid we'll make a misstep, but we want to make sure we're putting our resources on the right side of the issues and we're doing the case correctly. And I think all three of those cases show the commitment, the professionalism, the importance of the work we do, despite how hard it is to do it and do it well.
So just within the last couple of months, the decision for the Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado came down from the Supreme Court. Can you talk about that case a little bit and why that ruling is so devastating to the LGBT community?
Absolutely. So, as you know, Masterpiece was the fourth decision decided by Justice Kennedy. So we go back to the Lawrence case in 2003, where the sodomy laws were ruled unconstitutional. That was a huge issue, for privacy. We've got, I'm trying to think what the next one was in that line. It was a Colorado law that was struck down. I'm blanking on the name of that, but the Colorado law that prohibited any municipality from enacting any kind of pro-LGBT kind of ordinance. Kennedy wrote that, striking that down. Then, of course, there was the Windsor case, and then Obergefell, the same-sex marriage cases. So, you think that you've got a friend in Justice Kennedy, even though he is certainly on the conservative wing of the court. So the case that went up, the Masterpiece Cake, it is an interesting case. And it's one that's very important to all of us, especially with LGBT rights. So what we're dealing with there is there's a state law that prohibits discrimination in public accommodation. So, and then they have different classes. It's not just based on LGBT, that's what gets all the focus, but it's also based on race and gender and disability and a lot of other categories. So in public accommodation, a store owner cannot refuse to provide service to a person if they're in that protected class, if they would provide that same service to anyone else who enters their store, and in this case it was a bakery. So these cases are really important because what's happened recently is there's been more and more opposition to them on religious grounds. Now, of course, again, as the ACLU, we have been fighting for religious rights for forever and protection of those. But what we've seen is a shift from protecting religious rights and people's rights to practice their religion, and so using religion sort of as a shield to let them practice and exercise their constitutional rights, to using it as a sword to deny other people rights, to say, wait a minute, I don't have to comply with this non-discrimination ordinance because it's against my religious beliefs. The obvious problem with that, if you do that, is every person becomes a law to themselves. So I run a bakery, I might not want to make you a cake because I think women should stay home and not be out in the workplace. Or I might think that if a person of color enters the shop, I might not want to serve them for religious beliefs that I think the races should be separate. And that was used to justify segregation. Religious views were used to justify segregation for a long time. So it's hard to overstate the importance of Masterpiece Cake in terms of looking at the issue of, is it constitutional for a state or other, it would also apply to the federal government where there's such a law, or local, is it constitutional for the state to require baker who has religious objections, or any shop owner, any owner of a place of public accommodations, is it appropriate for them to refuse service based on their own religious convictions? So we thought this would be a blockbuster case, and nobody really knew how it was going to go. You listen to the oral arguments at the Supreme Court and you're trying to read the tea leaves, and no one knew how to go. So the decision, Justice Kennedy did write the decision. We know it's a 5-4 decision. I don't personally think it's devastating, but I think it's troubling. But here's the thing with Masterpiece Cake. What the court ultimately held, first of all, Kennedy and the 5 in the majority, what he held was that, and he said it multiple times, there was absolutely nothing wrong, in fact, they're commonplace, with laws that protect LGBT persons. Now, you would think, in 2018, we wouldn't really have to say that, but we do, and there's a lot of states that don't have them. Certainly we don't have national. So it was an important affirmation of the existence of protecting LGBT persons as a class in non-discrimination ordinance. That's very important. The troubling part was the focus on religion. Now, to be clear, there's nothing in that decision that says that religion trumps LGBT ordinances. There isn't. The problem in that case that Kennedy identified, perhaps unjustifiably so, relied on, but is that the people who decided that case, the group of commissioners that made up their rights commission, at least one of them had made extremely negative comments about the baker's religion, just ridiculously negative about religion is the scourge of humanity and that it's horrible and we can never, ever, ever, ever pay attention to it. What Justice Kennedy did is then took that statement and said, basically the entire commission's decision, finding the baker had violated this ordinance, is invalid. That's not a new phenomenon. I mean, if you think about it, anytime you have an adjudicatory commission or a court that decides a case based on its own biases, that's grounds to throw that decision out. I mean, that's Con Law 101, Procedural Due Process 101. So it's not troubling. You can read Masterpiece as simply affirming the principle that you cannot have biased adjudicators of a controversy and have a valid decision, right? The troubling part was that many people, especially conservative people who rely on the religious arguments, are trying to, I think, restyle the case or rewrite the case a little bit to rely on it. The problem is that we're going to have a different court very soon. So the question is, what part of Masterpiece will come out and be affirmed in the future? Will it be continued affirmation of pro-LGBT non-discrimination ordinances, or will it be a continued rise in using religious views, again, as a sword to harm other people and deny them equal rights, rather than as a shield, which is what it was intended to initially, to protect people so they can exercise their religion. So it's not the worst decision we could have gotten, but like all of Kennedy's decisions, it wasn't the best either. One thing I'll say about all of Kennedy's decisions is that they're a little bit murky on the constitutional principles on which they rely, which has subjected them to criticism. So he has been a friend of the LGBT community. We're certainly glad we have those string of decisions. It's not the most bedrock constitutional principles or precedent you would like going forward to rely on. And I don't think Masterpiece is going to be the problem. I think the problem is going to be the composition of the court going forward, and the extension of religious rights, allowing individuals or organizations to basically make up their own standards for what the law should be and when they need to recognize all persons' rights as opposed to follow the law.
So in Ohio right now, we have a law prohibiting transgender folks from changing their names on their birth certificates, and you are working on the case.
Yes.
Can you tell me some more about that case and why it is so important?
Absolutely. So we've been working on this for a long time. So the issue of can transgender individuals change the gender marker on their birth certificate. As you probably know, Ohio law allows people to change things on their birth certificate, your name, for example. You can change that. When children are adopted, they'll actually change the names of the parents on the birth certificate so it appears that the adopted parents are birth parents. There is nothing in the statutes itself. There's a lot of statutes that deal with keeping of records in Ohio, and especially birth certificates. But there's nothing that addresses gender markers on birth certificates, changing them. So what the Ohio Department of Health has done, along with the Bureau of Vital Statistics, those are the two organizations in charge of maintaining birth certificates and accurate birth certificates at that, they have a policy saying that they cannot change gender markers on birth certificates because they don't have the authority to do so. Now, we started on this project years and years ago, and going back roughly 3 years now, we had a coalition group. It's a great, I love working with coalitions. So Equality Ohio and Trans Ohio and us and some other private attorneys have been working this. And we had meetings with the Ohio Department of Health officials, and they were very responsive to us. And our point was, look, you have an obligation, a statute, to maintain accurate birth certificate records. You're not doing that. You're letting people change everything, but not make it consistent with their gender. Their position was, we don't have the power to do that. Again, they were receptive and pleasant, but they don't have the power to do that. So what we're fighting about in court, the lawsuit we filed on March 29th of this year, 2018, what we're challenging is the policy in which they're saying that they just have no authority to do that. And what we're arguing is that failing to let transgender individuals have a gender marker on their birth certificate that corresponds with their lived gender violates their right of privacy, because every time they have to show their birth certificate, they out themselves as transgender. And that's especially curious because the state of Ohio allows you to change your gender on things like your Medicare, your Medicaid records, your driver's license. At the federal level, you can change it on your passport and other identity documents, Social Security. So this is just the outlier. So what it means is if you're applying for a job or going through security clearance or education or housing, a lot of different benefits, if you're transgender, you're going to out yourself if you have to show your birth certificate because it's going to be inconsistent with your lived experience and in your presentation and inconsistent with the other identity documents. So it's a denial of a lot of things. So it's a privacy violation, which also subjects them to risks of physical harm, and that's a major issue. It's also an equal protection argument because you let everyone else change relevant and important information, but not transgender people. Then we also have a compelled speech argument, which is that by requiring transgender people to maintain the gender based on what the state says it is, you're requiring the transgender person to speak what the state is saying, not convey their own message as to the gender, again, that they live and that they know that they are. So we just filed it in March of this year. We're going through early stages. Not surprisingly, the state filed a motion to dismiss, which is its right to do. And we've just briefed that, so we're just in that stage. So the next decision will be, the court will decide, does this case go forward or not? We're very confident that it will, but it's going to be a very long road, a very long road. We were hoping, and one thing that I should say about this case is, Ohio is one of only a couple of states that don't allow any kind of change on the gender marker. So we were really hoping that when we filed this lawsuit, the state would say, oh, look, we're the outlier. We're only, 1 out of 3 out of 50 states that doesn't allow this, but they didn't. They're taking a hardline position, so which is, again, their right to do. So we will be litigating this and hopefully come to the right decision. Just the other thing I would say that's really important about this case is it's important in the everyday lives of transgender individuals. That's really important. It's also important because what we want is ultimately a process where they can change the gender marker by going through an administrative procedure, not have to have a court hearing and all of that, but just the way that many other states are doing it, the most progressive way of doing it is just filing an affidavit with appropriate documentation as to your gender. So we're swinging for the fences here, and we've got really, really good arguments. Again, dealing with conservative courts, you can never predict what's going to happen, but we're optimistic, working really hard, and we think it's a really, really important case.
So you're currently general counsel
Yes.
of our board, and you have long served in leadership positions with the ACLU, including as board president.
Right.
What made you want to serve the organization in this way?
That's a really great question. I would say, again, I keep saying Chris Link. I know that name's come up a lot. She's a very persuasive person. And I know some other people who served on the board, and one of them was leaving to go to India for a, I don't know, Fulbright or something. And she said, there's an opening on the board, you should really apply. This was the Cleveland chapter, not the state board. And I said, well, I don't know, I'm really busy or whatever. And then Chris gave me a call and she said, you've got a lot of skills. She was pretty charming about it. And you could just try it for a while and see how it works. And it's been about 25 years now and I'm still doing it. So, but I do think board service is important. I've been on a couple other community boards. And generally, we all know people who are on 15 boards and I admire them for that kind of thing. My philosophy has been work with one or two and really give it everything you can in your spare time. So, and it's worked out really well for me.
How do you feel that being an ACLU leader has impacted your life?
It's been fascinating. I think it's made me a more courageous person in a lot of ways, in other aspects of my life, definitely. I certainly am more informed about how things go on. I thought I knew a lot about government and laws and that kind of thing, having gone through law school. I worked at a big firm first, so I thought I was fairly sophisticated on how the world works. I really wasn't, and I think the ACLU's opened my eyes to things like inequities and how those play out in so many different areas. And sometimes I wish I didn't know some of the things that I do, about, again, we talked about racism a little bit and those kind of issues, but it's been incredible in terms of my personal growth and my professional growth as well.
So I'm going to shift the focus a little bit to activism. What is the importance of litigation as activism?
That's a great question because we debate that a lot at the ACLU. I mentioned earlier that one of the myths about the ACLU is something happens and we rush into court immediately. We do sometimes, like with the Muslim ban, we do rush in, but a lot of times it's a very thoughtful process. And the thing with litigation is, because we have three branches of government, you can win the battle and lose the war. And what I mean about that is, so say for example, the birth certificate case, I suppose, is a good example. We thought about bringing that case in state court and maybe challenging the state statutes and argue that the state statute should be interpreted a certain way. And we thought about that. That would have really not been a good idea because ultimately, if we had convinced the Ohio Department of Health via the courts that they should be changing this gender marker, they had the power and the responsibility to do it, the legislature can just change the law. So the great thing about constitutional arguments rather than statutory interpretations, if you convince a court that it's a fundamental constitutional right, the legislature can't legislate over that. But legislation is somewhat of a limited tool. So we have to think about it in terms of two things. One is, what's the immediate impact? Do we need something tomorrow? Can we rush in and get a preliminary injunction? Do we need to march in now? So we have to think about can we spend the time that litigation takes to get a result? And the second thing is, we have a profound belief that our job is not only to make the world better, but to do no harm. And sometimes with litigation, you can end up creating bad precedent. I know, for example, the ACLU, if you look at its timeline, National ACLU, it sort of brags about the case that we generically, the ACLU, the first same-sex marriage case, the Nelson v. Becker case in, I think, 1970. That was a very badly litigated case, with apologies to anybody who still litigated it, and it created a Supreme Court precedent that really set the movement back. And I think about that case a lot when we're looking at other things. So you can't be afraid to use litigation as an effective tool, but you always have to be mindful that there are potential downsides. And again, looking at this era we're going into with the Trumpian court, very conservative court, we're going to have to be more selective, and that's a tough balance.
What are some other activist experiences you've had over the years?
Well, I think one of the first things that I worked on a lot, I worked out with the Fair Housing Agency. I was recruited onto that board as well at a time. It was called the Cuyahoga Plan, and it was very well known, nationally known, dealing, with housing issues. Again, mostly we're dealing with racial issues here in the Cleveland area, and it had a bit of a meltdown. It fired some employees and they'd sued, so I was brought on the board at that point. And I learned a lot about fair housing, and I became the general counsel of that organization as well. and I've worked on some other boards and that kind of thing. I would tell you, I mentioned this before, there are things that I'd really love to do. I'd love to work on environmental issues. I'd love to work on animal rights issues, but there's a limit to how many hours a day you have. And also, I mentioned before, the animals, the emotional component of it, I would have a really hard time, I think, dealing with that. So some of my activism has been a commitment, a financial commitment. That's really important. I mean, I'm not saying that in any way to brag or whatever. It's just, it might even just be the way I handle my guilt by not being even more active than I am. But there are a number of causes that I support financially. I used to do more, going to rallies and protests and that kind of thing. I've always had a little bit of a mixed feeling about whether those change things, but I do know for the participants, it's an amazing feeling to know other people, whether 10 people show up or 100,000, to know other people really care, and it gets the publicity. And what I've noticed lately with an awful lot of protests, whether it's Me Too or just take any issue, the signs are so creative a lot of times, and then those get media buzz with the social media, and sometimes I think those have such a profound impact as well. So activism is so important, and I'm always encouraging friends and family to be more active. And the usual response is, I'm so busy, I've got kids, and I people say, I've got kids, I've got a job, I understand all that. It's true, not everybody can do that, but everybody can do something, right? So I'm not even as active as I would like to be, but I do what I can.
What was one of your favorite protests that you attended?
I think it's been more the local ones. To me, Tamir Rice, I attended a couple of those, the protests locally after Tamir Rice. I have to say, again, all of the cases, we're dealing with so many issues of Black people being shot by police. And I know it's an incredibly controversial issue for so many reasons, but the Tamir Rice case, I think, has resonated with me. He's a 12-year-old who was outside a recreational center there, and reports were called in that he had a gun and he was harassing people. It turned out he had like an air pistol or a BB gun or something like that. But no one was around him, and the police showed up, pulled up right next to the shelter. They say they told him to put his hands up or whatever, and they shot him almost immediately. He's 12 years old. That case resonates with me. So being with other people who feel that pain, I have to say again, at the same time, I'm not a person of color. I felt a little awkward. I don't begin to pretend like I can feel the pain that community experiences with these losses and the continuing discrimination and suffering they endure. But just being around that group and knowing so many people cared. Another, the Transgender Day of Remembrance is incredibly important. That's national, but the local Transgender Day of Remembrance is incredibly profound because we carry people's names, people who've been murdered in the last year who are transgender, and it really brings the community together, and so that's been incredibly meaningful for me as well.
Can you talk a little bit about the kinds of protections that are offered for the transgendered in Ohio?
It's very, very limited. In Ohio, we don't have any statewide law. There's been one proposed, but I doubt it's going anywhere currently. There are 20 municipalities that have different types of ordinances. The problem with the local ordinances, first they're geographically limited, and then they often have very limited remedies. So that's problematic. It's not like a state or national one. So in terms of transgender individuals, they're really, unless you're dealing with a local municipality kind of ordinance, there's really not much protection. I mean, what's happened at the federal level, which of course also applies in Ohio, is that during the Obama presidency, the agencies, whether it was the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission or the agencies that Department of Justice and the Civil Rights Division that oversee, or Department of Education oversee Title IX, education, they were extremely trans-friendly in a lot of ways, but they did that through administrative rules and that kind of thing. So let's say, for example, a child you have a trans child in school and they're being denied use of the appropriate restroom and that kind of thing. They could have filed a complaint with the Civil Rights division of the federal government of the Department of Justice, and they would have taken on their, and they're not taking every case, but they would have treated it as a legitimate Title IX complaint. Well, under Trump, all of those things have been rolled back. So whether you're looking at, if you look to state for relief, there's no statewide law. If you're looking to local ordinances, there are very few and they don't offer great relief. You look at federal remedies and those that were there were crumbling. So it's a very difficult time seeing the rollback that's happening for transgender individuals as well as LGBT individuals and really just any class of minorities.
In terms of improvements,
Yeah.
What kinds of improvements do you feel could be made?
Oh gosh, I have such a wish list. I mean, what I'd love to see is a national law passed that would extend an Equality Act that would extend rights in education, housing, public accommodation, employment, just across the board to LGBT persons. That would be the best fix. Just recognize it's a protected class, and it should be based on the history and continued discrimination, and treat people in that class as other people are treated. That would be my fondest wish. Second would be passing the statewide law, which I think still is a long shot, despite a lot of groups. Again, Equality Ohio is working very hard for that. They've done an amazing thing, and I think this is fascinating too. I mentioned earlier popular culture and how that influences people and decisions, including how they vote and vote on different issues. But in addition to that, the business community's got an incredibly powerful voice. So Equality Ohio and other consortium that we are part of, the ACLU of Ohio, that we're a working group, has signed on incredible number of businesses around the state that are very pro-LGBT rights and are actually backing statewide laws. So maybe there is reason for optimism there. And then, the last choice again is the local ordinances. Cuyahoga County right now, the ACLU is very active in that, and I've been testifying before the county council here in Cuyahoga County trying to get a statewide non-discrimination ordinance, and that will probably come up for vote sometime next month. There's been a ton of pushback. The Catholic Diocese has urged resistance. There have been other conservative groups who have urged resistance, and they've just been burying the 11 members of the council in emails and calls saying, don't pass this, that it's a terrible thing and it'll hurt business and all of that. Meanwhile, business people are showing up saying, no, it's not going to hurt us. Actually, it would be helpful if you're going to hire employees and things. One thing we talk a lot about in Ohio, and certainly Cleveland there, is the brain drain, that people go off to other states. Young people, college graduates, law school, they go off to other states that are more progressive, and that's what they want to see. So employers here across the state, and certainly the Cleveland area and Cuyahoga County, they're saying, we're having a hard time hiring young people because they don't want it, not just LGBT people, but their allies as well. They don't want to come to a place where they feel like the politics are regressive, and they have choices. So, there's just a lot of push from a lot of different quarters to move these pro-LGBT laws forward. It's just, we're in this time of incredible backlash, so it's hard to know which way the winds are blowing on any particular day.
What other issues do you feel are most pressing in the fight for LGBT rights?
What I'm afraid of, and some of the founders of the ACLU said this, I think Roger Baldwin, but certainly other people said, no battle for civil liberties, no civil rights are ever really won fully. You have to keep relitigating, and we get tired of that. But that's what I'm afraid of. I mean, people talk about, will Obergefell be overturned? That's a concern. Same-sex marriage, that's a concern. I think that's kind of a long shot, because I think Chief Justice Roberts is very aware of the court's long-term history and how the court will view his term, and I don't think he would favor reversing Obergefell, but what you can see is that might be coming up are a number of cases that just kind of cut back the rights and modify them a little bit. So I'm concerned about the battles we've already won, moving backwards. Gay people in the military, trans people in the military, there's just an awful lot of things that, it's kind of been my experience that the people who most recently secured rights are the most vulnerable to losing them. And I'm very worried about that, because I think we just gotten to a really good tipping point with lesbian and gay people. We were, in terms of rights in a positive way, we were getting there with transgender individuals, and now I feel like the backlash, and it's hard to really get a bearing on how serious the backlash is. I think these midterm elections coming up in November will be huge in terms of telling the tale of what's going on. So I think we may be relitigating this when I talk about, gay parenting. I mentioned that earlier on when you asked me about one of my most difficult cases. That's been so controversial for so long, but for 20 years it's been established that gay and lesbian parents can be absolutely good parents, and that shouldn't even be an issue in deciding best interest of the child. Look at other characteristics of the parents, but their sexual orientation isn't one of them. But I worry that those kind of things are going to start to be eroded if we continue to see the conservative movement and the injection of religious views into the law. And again, I have my own religious convictions. The ACLU officially and me personally, I will fight very hard for people to have their free exercise rights and those kind of things, but not in a way that's going to harm other people, and I'm worried about that happening.
So we've talked a bit about legislation in terms of LGBT
Yes.
rights, and you wish that there would be a state law and a
Federal,
national
yeah.
law. It's on your wish list. But even if those things don't come forward, what can allies do to make our communities better for the LGBT community?
Yeah, I don't think the importance of allies can be understated, and sometimes it's so important. I wrote an article, it's been like 12 years ago, now it's hard to believe, on transformative learning, and that was in a very conservative period too. It was pre-Obama. So the point of that is, how do you change people's minds? That's really, it's transformative learning. It's a whole discipline of psychiatry and sociology. And I studied it for a while and I wrote an article about it. But the whole point is, how do you change people's hearts and minds? Almost exclusively, the best way to change a person's heart and mind is through personal contact. And as we've seen, the laws can actually cause backlash and cause, negative things, or good court opinions can cause backlash. So I think the role of allies is so important, and just in informal settings, you're with a group of friends and they're making gay jokes or those kind of things, or jokes about a transgender person, and just being willing to speak up and say, that I'm not cool with that. That's not, that's a person with feelings, et cetera, and being educated on the issues and then speaking out when appropriate. It doesn't mean everybody has to be a crusader, but certainly just being willing to be a defender when a defense is necessary of someone who's more vulnerable. And that, again, it's not just LGBT. It could be based on race or disability or immigration status, or a lot of different categories. But it's just critical. I might not be able to reach your grandmother or your uncle or whatever, but you can. Having said that, I'm not suggesting that Thanksgiving dinner become a free-for-all over political arguments or that kind of thing.
So my final question for you today
Yes.
is, what advice would you give to those who want to be involved in activism and social justice?
Right. I think the very first thing is just to become educated on the issues. I see so many people shooting from the hip on both sides. Some issue comes up and, we absolutely have to, lock Clinton up, and then other people are like, no, she's a saint. And you have to study the issues and try and get all the different perspectives and really inform yourself. I think that's really lacking. And I will say with myself as well, I do at times have a certain prism that I see everything through. So try and get both sides, because you're not going to be able to reach across an aisle or convince anyone else of your position if you don't understand the other side's position, and at least be willing to give it some credence, even if your initial reaction is, oh, hell no, that's totally wrong. So I think that's important. The other thing that is so important is voting, and that's, again, becoming an informed voter. I think a lot of people don't realize, I look at the numbers, because we do so much voting rights work at the ACLU, and it's so important. Our gerrymandering work, probably one of the most important cases we've ever taken on. But then I look at the numbers of people who vote, and I understand why people don't. I hear what they're saying about it doesn't matter, or I was too busy, or my baby was sick. I understand all of those. But the beauty of our democracy here is that we have an opportunity to voice our opinion through the ballot box. And I have done that forever. And my candidates hardly ever win. And then they win and they don't do what I thought they were going to do. But nonetheless, it's, it's a really important opportunity. So being an informed voter and voting in the local elections, because that's where people start their political careers, right? They start as on the local city council, and then they move up maybe to a state position. All of a sudden they're at a national level. And you're like, well, where did that person come from? Well, they've been around for 20 years. And so I think being an informed voter is probably one of the most important things you can do to make sure that our democracy survives and that our civil liberties continue to move forward in a positive direction.
Well, thank you, Sue. It's been wonderful talking with you today.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for interviewing me. I really enjoyed it, and it's been fascinating to do this look back through time, my involvement with the ACLU. And I will certainly say that my life has been much richer and I think much more meaningful due to my involvement with the ACLU. So I feel very privileged by that and very thankful.